Hey there, Pre-AP. Let's go through Outline 8.6, Plant Kingdom, in our Taxonomy unit. On this video, we're going to go through Part 1, 2, and 3. Part 4 and 5 will be on a separate video, so let's get started. If you are a plant, you are categorized into 4 major groups, so let's know those. You are a bryophyte, which is a moss. You are non-vascular. And let's write down what non-vascular means. Non-vascular means that you say no a lot, kind of like a prokaryote. You have no roots, stems, or leaves. You have root-like structures, you have stem-like structures, and you have leaf-like structures, but you do not have true roots, stems, or leaves. Let's say that you are not non-vascular. Let's say that you are vascular, like the remaining groups. Pterophytes, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. You are vascular, which means that you have roots, stems, and leaves. You have those 3 basic structures, and you are separated into those 3 different groups, though you are all vascular, depending on what type of seed that you have. So a pterophyte, those are things like ferns. You're vascular, but you do not reproduce with a seed like you find in fruits. If you're an angiosperm, you are vascular, but you are considered to be a naked seed plant. What that means, you can go ahead and write this down. That means that you reproduce with a cone, like a cedar tree or a pine tree. If you're an angiosperm, you are a flowering plant. Instead of a cone, you reproduce with fruit. So, gymnosperm, just put out beside there cone, and then angiosperm right up beside there, just to give you a heads up on what we're talking about. They reproduce with fruit. So the basic structure of plants, we need to know that roots, they're below, and then you have a shoot. Another word for shoot is stem, if you want to put that out beside there. It is above ground. And then you have mesostemic tissue on the tips of roots. That allows the plant to know, where to grow in height and length. And then sometimes you have this waxy cuticle, as you can see in my picture. Those are for herbaceous plants, which means go ahead and outline out beside their herb. They're soft and leafy. That cuticle is going to help it, shed water and not absorb too much water and then die. So you have vascular tissue. If you're not a bryophyte, so highlight out beside there, not found in bryophytes. These are the things for pterophytes, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. You have 2 different types of tissue. If you are vascular, remember vascular means you have roots, stems, and leaves. You either have xylem or phloem. So if you highlight xylem, that carries water so that you can, go through photosynthesis, because remember in photosynthesis you split water. If you are phloem, highlight that you carry sugar water. That means that sugar has to be broken down in the water so that you're taking up sugar or food, if you want to write that out beside there. Another big difference between xylem and phloem, highlight out beside xylem that these are considered to be dead, hollow cells. Then for phloem, highlight that these are considered to be living cells. So again, if you have seeds, whether you are a gymnosperm or an angiosperm, you want to be able to have your seeds survive during dry time. So just kind of getting you to think about, hey, we're going to talk about seeds. If you're an angiosperm, you reproduce with flowers, which will later turn into fruit. Gymnosperms do not reproduce with flowers. They reproduce with cones. In a little while, we're going to talk about the relationship between flowers and animals. We call the animals that help out with, spreading pollen from flower to flower, so they are pollinated. We call them pollinators, which are the bees, hummingbirds, and, sometimes bats. And we'll talk about why they're so important. And then again, if you're an angiosperm, you're going to reproduce with fruit. Now, fruit comes in many different shapes and forms. The traditional over to the left, like, that cherry tree. Or you wouldn't consider it to be a fruit, like on the right, that dandelion. Remember, fruits are just a vehicle for seeds to be dispersed. Again, just to review, basic plant structure. Roots are below the ground, and then stems or shoots, they are above the ground. Real quick, let's draw this. So draw you kind of a plant-like structure. This is the shoot, root, and then ask yourself, what kind of plant would this probably be? Would it be vascular or non-vascular? Well, ask yourself the question, does it have roots, stems, and leaves? Boom, vascular. So go ahead, draw you this picture. It does not have to look exactly like that picture. A stick flower will do fine. If you want to pause the video so you can draw it, you can. But I'm moving on. And then, just to review again, that you have these lovely mesostemic tissues on the tips of roots that are going to help your plant know where it's going to grow in height and length. If you remember back in good old cellular respiration and photosynthesis unit, we talked about stomatas. Stomatas are the lovely openings on the underside of leaves that help us exchange gas during photosynthesis. Again, xylem carries water. They are considered to be dead, hollow tissue. Phloem carries sugar or food. If you want to put that out beside there, they are considered to be living tissue. All right, we're moving on to part 2. We're going to talk about bryophytes. All right, so good old bryophytes. Let's highlight that. There are 3 major groups of bryophytes. There are the Hepatophyta, which are the phylum. If you see P-H-Y-T-A at the end, that means phylum. So Hepatophyta, these are things called liverworts, like in my picture. And why they're called liverworts is wort is the old English word for plant. So that's where you get that. Then there are Anthocerophyta, which are hornworts because they stick up like the horns on an animal. Remember, these are non-vascular. They do not have roots, stems, or leaves, but they have root-like structures, but they're not true roots. They have stem-like or shoot-like structures, but they're not true shoots because they don't have vascular tissue. They do not have xylem, and they do not have phloem. Bryophyta, these are true mosses, so highlight that's moss. This is a picture of moss underneath an electron microscope. Please highlight that if you are part of the bryophyte phylum, you are very small in size, and you only have cellulose in your cell wall. If you only have cellulose, you are not very strong, you are very weak, and you grow very close to the ground. So this is how bryophytes reproduce. Usually, because they are close to the ground, that means that they are going to get a lot more rain. That raindrop, if you look at my picture, that raindrop is going to touch that bryophyte. This one has, our example is Anthophyta. And it is going to release the gametes, the sperm. So plants go through sexual reproduction, gametes. And it will kind of be carried by the water to the female plant. And it will receive the sperm, and then it will, fertilize the egg. So Their leaf-like structures are called microphyll. So if you would please highlight that. So how moss reproduces, they have spirophytes. And then this is a peat moss bog in Upper Canada. This is just a gigantic field of moss. And they call it a bog because they grow really well near water. Alright, so that's pretty much it for part 2. The rest of it, if I did not mention it, the only other thing that I need you to highlight for me is I need you to highlight that bryophytes possess structures similar to roots called rhizoids, which are supposed to, there for support, just like roots. And then if you go to the very end of part 2, capital letter D, we need to highlight that number 1 underneath, and that capital letter D, they move water and other materials by diffusion and osmosis. Think back to cell membrane. They have a cell membrane because they have no vascular tissue. They don't have xylem to pick up that water. And then, therefore, the plant can only be a couple of cells thick. They're very weak, remember. While we like bryophytes at the end, ecological and economical importance, they're a major food source in the tundra because it's very cold there. Not many things are going to grow. And then again, peat moss, it's really good fuel source because it holds a lot of CO2. They are a great soil conditioner because they can hold 20 times their weight in water. So they're really good for gardeners and farmers. Alright, and then real quick, we're going to go on to part 3. We're going to talk about pterophytes. So we're moving into vascular plants. We got done with non-vascular. So we're going to look at the pterophytes, this group. Good old pterophytes. So there are 2 types of pterophytes. There are lycophytes, and then there are going to be the true pterophytes. So if you are a pterophyte, you actually get to have a little bit of a more complex sugar than cellulose, lignin, and then another complex sugar called pectin. If you've ever made homemade jelly, you can buy pectin at the grocery store because it's a great thickener for jelly because it's a natural sugar. It just doesn't have a really good taste. So this is in their cell wall. They have real roots because this is a vascular plant. They have real leaves because they have vascular tissue, xylem and phloem. So real quick before we move on to pterophytes, lycophytes, they are existing species and they're mostly tropical. And, you know, the reason why we only mention them is because they formed the first real forest and they decomposed and they made crude oil or fossil fuels. That's why we mention those. So if you'll flip over, we're going to talk about pterophytes real quick, then we'll come back to epiphytes. So pterophytes, there are 3 types, and those are called, this is hard to pronounce, guys. Xylophytes, which are, they branch in a Y. That would be this picture. You also have sphenophytes, or horsetails, which are right here. They actually look like a horsetail. They are kind of in rings or whorls. We just need to know that, that's an example. Nothing really, and they kind of look like a horsetail. And then the true ferns. You're going to see a lot of people go out and buy ferns. You can buy them in pots or hanging baskets. A lot of people will put them on their house in the good old South. And if you will just put a star by ferns, those are the ones that we're really going to focus on. The others we just kind of casually mention. So, real quick, those are the lycophytes that I mentioned just a second ago. Those, a very, 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 very long time ago, decomposed into the earth, and they eventually turned into crude oil or fossil fuels. And then if you'll go to the very top, epiphytes. These are interesting. These are air plants because they grow on branches of trees. And then some of them can actually be poisonous to the tree. They can smother the tree of nutrients. And then there's our xylophiles. They just branch off like a Y. Kind of sphenophytes. Those look like a horsetail again. And then ferns, the true ferns. You find a fern, you can find them growing sometimes out of rocks, mainly on the ground. So what we need to know is they have these things called megaphylls, or out beside megaphyll, put the word leaf. And they're called fronds, and they look like this. They look like a little fan that you would fan somebody with. And they actually develop, so fronds develop from something called a fiddlehead. And why they call it a fiddlehead is the person who discovered these thought that if you had a fiddle, so let's kind of draw a fiddle, draw some strings on it. You had a stem that came out, and then it would curl at the end. Fiddlehead. Fiddlehead, or the head of a violin. And then what those good old fiddleheads come from is they come from spores. And they develop on the underside of the megaphylls. And those spores have a fancy name called sori, because they look like little sores all over the bottom. And then eventually they produce tiny little heart-shaped little bitty baby ferns, and then they grow into a fiddlehead, and then they grow into a frond. Alright, so we're done with part 1 through 3, and I'm going to make a separate video with part 4 and 5. So I hope that was helpful, guys.